Good afternoon, and I want to acknowledge first of all, of course, that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Kulin Nation, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. This session is sponsored by Golders Girls Book Club, which I have to say sounds like a lot of fun. Are there any members of Golders Girls? Hello. I think that's another interview that I want to have with Golders Girls Book Club. Golders niece. Royalty over there. Thank you. Up close. They're on the expensive seats, the reserved for Golders. I'm Sarah Kanowski, the host of Conversations on ABC Radio and Podcast, and I usually talk to guests about their real lives, things that have happened to them, events they've witnessed with their own eyes, places they've been, experiences they've had. But these two authors bring us into very different territory, a place of sometimes strange and unsettling visions, where it's felt rather than verifiable or external experience that holds sway, where it's the imagination that draws the map and it's up to the intellect to keep up. Simon Tedeschi is a concert pianist, and for some reason, being exceptionally talented in one field has not been enough for Simon, and he's written his first book, Fugitive. Bryan Walpert is a poet, essayist, and literary critic. He's Professor of Creative Writing at Massey University in Auckland, New Zealand, and Entanglement is his first full-length novel, one that's recently been named as a finalist for New Zealand's National Book Award. Please make both Bryan and Simon very welcome. Simon, I want to start with you. How long has this book been swimming around in your head?
30 years. It took me about 3 years to write, but upon finishing it, I realized that I was drawing from things that happened to me when I was a child. So I suppose, like learning a musical piece and practicing a musical piece, there's the practicing of it itself, but then there's the formative parts before the practicing. So it's really a difficult question to answer, but yeah, I would say 30 years.
Well, what prompted you to sit down and finally put pen to paper or finger to keyboard?
To be honest, I think I had only relatively recently found a degree of peace in my life. I met my wife, Laurabelle, who is down there. The life of a concert pianist is a strange and very alienating one. And I suppose in many respects, hitting early middle age, I felt that I'd finally had some grounding in my personality, in my circumstances that allowed me. But to be honest, there was no particular event or decision that caused me to write a book, as it were. I simply felt compelled to put pen to paper.
Tell us about the title Fugitive. Where does it come from?
Fugitive is obviously a term meaning many things, like a fugitive from the law, or like that Harrison Ford film. A fugue, the musical form, is fugitive because all of the lines are running away. My experiences of my family as fugitives simply for existing as Jews in Europe. But the idea that so many of our own thoughts and the way we experience time are so both very fugitive and so tenuous, and we can only really look back on them later rather than experiencing them in the moment. And all of these ideas came together in this book in a way that I suppose even I didn't expect.
Well, you didn't mention the composer and pianist Prokofiev in that answer, but it's his fugitives that are reflected on. Tell us about how his pieces of music figure in this story.
Well, if there's any narrative, I suppose, in this book, it is a piece by Prokofiev for piano, which in Russian are called mimolyotnosti. But and like a lot of words in foreign languages, there's no real translation. It could be called essences or iridescences or ephemeralities, but was translated into French as vision fugitive and therefore into English as fugitive. And these pieces are themselves very fugitive in that they run away from you. They only take about 30 seconds or 20 seconds each. And the challenge for a performer is to effectively put on a new hat every time a new piece is encountered in the sequence. And so much of that time in Russia in about 1917 to 1920 was fugitive. They were living moment by moment. And there's so many aspects that just tied together, and I felt myself returning all the time to that idea of fugitivity. And that's the connection with Prokofiev.
Bryan, I believe that you had a strange moment standing in your front yard that became the genesis of this book. What happened?
Well, I was standing in my front yard. I can't remember whether I just mowed the lawn or something of that nature. My kids were quite young, and I had this strange sensation that I had come back from the future and that I had the opportunity to do things again. I was thinking to myself, look how young my kids are. Look how young my wife is. I can do it again. It was a very strange moment. I was not prescribed any medication for that, but it did pass. But it became a sort of nagging notion that sparked the book.
The book is a weaving together of three different stories, and it constantly nudges the reader to ask if these stories are separate or in what kind of ways are they connected or entangled. Give us a sketch of the three different elements in this book.
Sure. So the three sections, one is called Time Traveler, and it follows someone who is trying to remember why they are where and when they are, but they know they have to change something, and they encounter a set of obstacles. The second section that we encounter takes place at the Center for Time at the University of Sydney, which that Center for Time exists. I was permitted to visit there. They were very nice to me and gave me a little time there, so to speak. And it follows protagonist Paul as he researches a novel about time at the center, meets a New Zealand philosopher, falls in love with her, and she becomes pregnant. And that happens at the beginning of the book, at the beginning of that section, since it works backwards through his journal entries to his arrival. And the third section is an unnamed writer responding to a series of writing prompts in New Zealand.
Well, did you always plan on bringing those sections together, or how did you want the reader to come at those, what look at first like different stories?
I always saw it as a single story. It's hard to remember when those different parts started to arise, but I kept them in three separate Word files for as long as I could. And it's kind of like working on three stories. You sort of run out of steam on one, you move into the next one and the next one, so you always have something new to work on. And the moment where I brought them all together, which I postponed as long as I could, was a really exciting one, and to try to figure out how the parts interwove.
I guess with your background as a poet and a writer of shorter form, was that more manageable bites to chew on, working on it that way?
Absolutely. That's absolutely right. I knew I had to do it in small pieces because I wasn't used to writing in extended pieces. And so that gave me something to hang my hat on.
Well, let's hear from both of these works, because the voice of each of these books is so distinctive that I think you really only get a flavour of their work by hearing it. So, Bryan, let's start with you. And is there anything that we need to know or the audience need to know beforehand?
Sure. So, if I were going to sum up the book, it's about two tragedies and a love story. And the love story is the Sydney section. And the Sydney section, which I'm going to read a section from, also is where a lot of the time elements come through as the writer tries to figure out what time is time travel possible, all those sorts of things. So I'll read a section from that. He blames himself for an injury his brother received, which left him in a wheelchair. So that's touched on here. It's an American writer from Baltimore. What is time? The closer I look, the less certain I become. It slips away like a dream I tried to hold on to this morning as light poured through the window, half the curtains pulled aside by Anise when she woke before me. I don't remember all the details, but I know the dream had to do with my brother, with Daniel. I haven't had a dream about him for nearly 2 weeks. They always come back. Sometimes I'm explaining to him simply and straightforwardly what happened, how sorry I am, things I've never been able to do in his presence. Though in those dreams, the lightening I feel on speaking with him is manifested physically as he says, "It's okay, look, I'm fine now," gets out of his wheelchair, strides across the room. This time, though, we were children again, walking on the ice, and I was pushing him. He was pushing me back, as we used to do, to get the other to slip. For instance, the idea that time flows like a river, push that idea further, and it doesn't take long to ask what time flows in. That is, what the riverbed is, or maybe more pertinent, at what rate time flows, if we are to say it flows. We can say a river flows at 3 kilometers per hour, so time flows at what? 1 hour per hour? There's nothing against which time would seem to flow except another dimension of time, a kind of meta-time, but then you just have the same problem again, an infinite regress. It makes my head ache. Does time have a beginning? Can the term beginning be applied to something like time, since the very word presumes something time-like that must exist beyond time? Is time such an intrinsic part of the way we conceive the world that we are unable to develop even a language to circumvent it? When I'm lying with Anise on her bed, watching her hair slipping over her bare shoulder, running the tip of my finger along the smooth curves of her leg and hip, or when we lie on our backs, look at the ceiling and talk, time seems not to move at all. Yet when we look at the clock and see it is already 8, her morning's meeting merely an hour away, it seems to have moved more quickly than possible. A notion every lover at one time or another comes viscerally to know, like Milton's Eve in Paradise Lost, who tells Adam that neither season nor hour seems to press on them when they are together. Is it only our limited perception that gives the appearance that time passes? Is there time apart from change? If everything were frozen, every atom that composes Anise, the blue bath towel around her body, the white towel turban-like around her hair, me propped in bed on my pillows, the curtain puffed out by a breeze, the atoms that compose the numbers on the clock, would time still exist? The breeze lasted hardly at all. The heat of the day was already pressing into the room. Anise dropped her towel and walked, alas, into the bathroom. The red numbers on the clock clear enough. Then she emerged, fully dressed, her hair brushed, pulled into the ever-present ponytail, signaling work had started. She placed the too large silver watch on her slender wrist, looked at me in the bed, then emphatically at her watch said, "How nice to be a writer on residency." Eve to Adam, with thee conversing, I forget all time, all seasons, and their change.
Thank you, Bryan. In that section that you read, it's the story between this philosopher and the writer spending time at the Centre for Time, which you tell us is a real place, and you've been there, in fact. What goes on at the Centre for Time?
A lot of philosophy. I called them up and said, look, I want to set this part of this book there, and I was kind of embarrassed to mention the time travel part. I thought they were going to laugh at me, and hemmed and hawed a bit about that, but then it turned out they talk about time travel all the time. They're not embarrassed at all about it. It was actually wonderful. And they're very generous. They gave me a little spot, a little desk. They would meet with me, people would meet with me for coffee and talk about time. I was allowed into the seminars, which I quickly did not understand. I knew they were using words in English. I recognized some of the words, but they didn't mean the same thing to me. And also went to a graduate student seminar where they were actually very kind with my questions. So it was really quite wonderful. Yeah.
Simon, let's hear you read a section from Fugitive. But before you do, time is an alive concern in your book. In what kind of ways are you wrestling with the question of time, or does this book wrestle with time?
Actually, in many ways, in a remarkably similar way to Bryan's. The idea that I think it was Henry Bergson, who was French Jewish philosopher, who you probably know, and he said that time can't be measured because as soon as you try, it's over, and that really does my head in. So the idea of time, and I suppose which is related in many ways to trauma and irreparability and irrevocability, and so many aspects from that, history, that what has happened before, and all of the ramifications from that if time is, as they say, a construct or something that we observe, why does it feel so final a lot of the time? And this is, I suppose, a lot of the purging of my own demons and were expressed in this sense with regard to time in the book.
And I suppose as a musician, time is at the forefront of your artistic practice in terms of tempo, in terms of pausing. There's a way that you engage with time in that part of your life in a different way than as a writer, I imagine.
Yes, and also the act of musical performance, which is an act. Time is certainly changed and morphed and transmuted when you are performing, and also when you're completely hit or bowled over by a piece of art, and that sort of takes you into sublime time for me, and that's what I'm always craving in a world that I suppose in many ways has become so Disneyfied, that I'm craving that sublime quality all the time. And that's what I was attempting to achieve in the book, but it's certainly what impacts me as a person, as a writer and a musician.
When is the last time that you were stopped, when time stopped for you in front of something sublime?
Actually, just listening to that, I felt a real sense of, I lost myself for a second, which is a beautiful thing. But when I look at my wife, she's a visual artist. I get that all the time. Simply looking at a painting, I saw a Sisley painting in Sydney. Was it Sydney? Bendigo. And I was just hit, just absolutely bowled over. And it's very tempting, as I also write in the book, because it's a narcissistic wound when we see something that affects us like that. And it's very, very tempting to try to put ourselves above the artwork as a defense, and I do it too. And I suppose grappling with the power of art and our relative puniness around great art is one of the enduring themes in this book.
Well, please read a section for us. And is there anything that you want the listeners to know or the audience to know beforehand, or do we just throw ourselves in?
No, I think you can just throw yourself in. There is a type of silence that happens when you are floored by a work of art. I live for this silence. All borders swept away. All borders broken. No words necessary. No words possible. The work is everything. The work is nothing. Modern music is trash. I like it. I loathe it. I prefer music with a tune. That's not music, that's noise. I found it interesting. It bored me. I didn't understand it. The mimolotnosti are not a mystery to be solved. They are entrails unearthed. Not only do the mimolotnosti mash up our brains, they threaten our locus of control. They disabuse us of the notion that we are little gods. Art is the person too beautiful for us to get a handle on, so we walk up to it like a drunkard and try to take it down a peg. I feel overjoyed to discover that Mozart had a fart diary, and that Lawrence Stern wrote simply for fame, and that Britain could be a bit of a prick. It heartens me that Michel Leiris took 25 years to write his diary, or that Virginia Woolf found Ulysses boring. I form a protective layer around my heart so I can retain the illusion that I am special, that I am individual, that I am greater than garlands of galaxies. I refuse to be vulnerable. I am not the turtle. I graft my skin with opinions, positions, postures. I drag the creators and their creations to my level. I fear to be remade. I may refuse to budge, but the sand shifts beneath my feet. The earth spins. I drift. Art is the ultimate narcissistic wound. When I play the Mimiljótnosti, I am met by a wall of faces, a gate of eyes. I want these 20 pieces to send everyone to hell or heaven. I want there to be nothing left to say, as if an atheist had seen the first spurt of an amputee's knee. Each Mimiljótnosti is shrapnel boring through the body. We stand in front of the Mimiljótnosti with our pudgy flesh and our rotten angles, and we are all blown up and distorted, and we are no more. I am less interested in what people say to me after a performance of the Mimiljótnosti than by the weave of their silences. After so many years, instinct has taught me how to read breathing, as poetry is a special kind of speaking, listening is heightened hearing. I play the Mimiljótnosti. I slide my eye to the right. I read the room in a heartbeat. I tell from the wind in a whisper whether someone I've never met before is tired, bored, or frightened. Bring me boredom. I want the boredom of Proust, the unclocking of time, the freedom of associative speech, the sleepy dance of shapes, a lyrical languor. From a whisper, one can sense the mood of a crowd, how it feels in its skin, how it takes on a certain shape, how it swells and snakes and shifts. Whispering is the only way a human can move through walls. In Stalin's Russia, there were two kinds of whisperers. Shepshutchi, who whispered so as not to be heard through the walls, and Sheptun, who whispered so as to be heard by the authorities. Petrograd, a house near the center. Prokofiev plays the Mimiljótnosti for the first time. I've heard a recording of him at the piano, and it's completely different to what I expected. Disjointed, wiry, cakes of colors, a Petrov pressed against a wet window. I've only ever played a Petrov in Siberia, in old halls that smelt of wood shavings and fish bones. To the right of the piano is a Japanese garden, untended. The poet Konstantin Balmont is in the far corner, tall and debonair, damasked in shadow, listening. On a settee, Kira Nikolaevna, a friend of both men, one leg over the other, smiling, craning her neck towards the music. She is brilliant, but will only ever be known for this moment. Balmont waits until the final chord unravels like strips of gauze. Then he pulls out his pen. I do not know wisdom. I leave that to others. I only turn Mimiljótnosti into verse. In each fugitive vision I see worlds. There is no color in the world. It is August 1917.
In that description just there where you read about as a when you play for an audience that you can read their silences, is that true for you? Is that your experience?
To a large degree, especially as someone who's been performing since I was so young. One of the, I suppose, unfortunate adaptive side effects is that you begin to be able to, with a fair degree of intuition and accuracy, read people's expectations of what they want you to be, but also whether the performance is going well, essentially. And I'm sure I'm not always right, but I think I'm mostly right.
Is it the same when you read from your work?
No, it is not the same, and that's because reading for me, probably because I'm so new at reading my own work, is such a strange experience, and I still haven't really quite got a handle on it, but it feels like looking at a home video of myself, whereas performing is much more interpretative than creative, I suppose, to the extent that there is a difference. And the more I've written, the more I see there actually is a very huge difference.
And in terms of those miniatures, those very small pieces by Prokofiev, tell me about learning to play them or when you first started playing them.
I've been playing them for so long I don't even remember when I learned them. And they're very unusual pieces and finished in 1920, as I said, and now we're in 2022, and if I play them still, they have the capacity to shock audiences still. That's how revolutionary they are. They are like music from another world or from Mars, and they are so truly avant-garde in that overused sense of the word. So I never get sick of them.
Bryan, when you have the descriptions of the Centre for Time in Entanglement, you describe a clock that they have there in the Centre for Time. What's it like?
It was I have no idea if it's still there, but at the time it was a clock that was, as I recall, it was sort of green and purple. It was on like a piece of plywood, and someone had it looked like painted like a grandfather clock, but sort of exaggerated. And the clock moved backwards, so it went in the wrong direction, but it went forwards. So it was still going forwards in time, just going counterclockwise. And so it played with your head. And the person who showed it to me said, if you don't think about it too hard, you'll know what time it is. Don't think about it. Yeah.
I guess one of the reasons that the philosophers at the Centre of Time are so interested in time travel, that you were initially surprised they were, is because it brings very close to the surface the question of free will and agency. Because if you can travel back in time, does that mean everything is predetermined? Otherwise, how can you change things in the future? How did you come at those questions in this book?
I dealt with free will a little bit. It is a very interesting question because if you believe in block time or eternalism, which is implicit in Einstein's theories, then the past, present, and future all exist in the same way that Sydney, Auckland, and Tokyo all exist. You can't say simultaneously because that suggests time, but they all exist spatially, so that everything you do, you can't change, and you've, in a sense, done it. I'm probably getting that wrong, but at the same time, you have the free will to do it. It's both at the same time. It does mess with your head, yeah.
Well, the writer character in your book asks, is it possible to write a time travel story that ends with redemption but remains consistent? Did you find an answer to that question?
The answer is maybe. You can't, by all the things I understand, have been led to understand, is you can't change the past. You can, by going back in time, if you could go back in time, you can make them happen the way they've happened, but you can't change them. So the question that I was struggling with was, can a book about time in some way be redemptive? And it depends what kind of redemption you're looking for. It can be redemptive in a literary sense, but perhaps not in any other sense. So I've left it, I've tried to leave it open for the reader to determine how redemptive it is. It depends how you read the book.
In one of the many interesting ideas about or reflections on time that is there in your novel is is one that that the character Anise refers to by the Italian physicist Carlo Rovelli, and his contrast between things and events. Can you explain that or illustrate that?
Sure, I hope I do it justice. Carlo Rovelli is this wonderful writer. He's a physicist, but he writes books. I don't know if any of you have read them. He's written several about physics. One of his most famous, I think, is his first, 7 Brief Lessons on Physics, which I highly recommend, because he writes like a poet. And he says that things and events are the same. And he gives the example, which I take from him in the book, in that if you take a thing like a stone or an event like a kiss, but a stone, it's just the same as a kiss. It just takes place over a very long time. It comes together as a stone, and then it comes apart, ultimately. And so things are events that are just long in duration from a human perspective. So in the book, I said, if you were a nanopod and it lived for a billionth of a second, then a human kiss would be a thing. Yeah.
Wow.
Like a mountain.
It's an amazing idea.
Yeah.
I don't want any of you to get to come away with the misapprehension that Bryan Walpert is just highfalutin, though, because I believe Hot Tub Time Machine is also part of the thinking that goes on to you when it comes to time travel.
Yes. So
not just Italian physicists, but also Hot Tub Time Machine.
Yes. When I'm not reading Carlo Rovelli, I'm watching Hot Tub Time Machine. You got that from something I said to somebody, because I love time travel movies and books, and I will watch anything with time travel, and that's sort of the example, Hot Tub Time Machine, and enjoy it. So, yeah.
Simon, there's a description or image in Fugitive that you return to, which struck me as I think that everyone can either recall doing, or if they have children, look at them doing, which is when you get to a border, when you get to somewhere that has a sign saying you are now entering New South Wales or you're now entering Victoria, we've got this urge to stand on either side and somehow be in two places at once. Tell me about that, the interest in borders and the mystery of borders that seems a preoccupation in Fugitive.
Yes, it is a preoccupation, and I suppose also that is tied in with my own experience as being a young performer, and all of the strange borders that occur in an existential sense when you sort of are a child but are forced to be an adult as well, and are in different places from one day to the next. But then there's borders in music, and then there's borders in life, like that I forget the name of it, that idea, if you keep on adding grains of sand, when does it become a pile? And that's just something that has just continually remained transfixed in my head. And also the idea of borders as the more obvious one in a geopolitical sense, which many of our own ancestors were subject to in a terrible way, but which others are experiencing now. And so I'm intrigued with a sense of space, and borders are also caught up with the idea of time as well. So the idea of the Mimilyottnosti, or Prokofiev's visions fugitives, are also one of borders. Prokofiev himself wrote about certain places that were safe and other places that were unsafe, where the shooting of soldiers was just around the corner when he was writing these pieces. And they are so small, and yet they represent a suite, which is a form. And yet Prokofiev would only sometimes ever play 3 at a time as an encore. I find that intriguing as well, because it must have been, just like the clash of a cymbal for many of his audiences, who were probably conservatives and thought modernism was degeneracy. So borders are tied in with, I think, everything Bryan was saying as well, which fascinates me.
You mentioned there this experience of being described as a prodigy, and that is something that comes up at various points in this book too. When you look back at that experience from this perspective in your life, how do you understand the dynamics of it? What does that do to a child and a child's own sense of their capacities or interests to be sort of celebrated or held up in that way?
Well, it definitely causes you 30 years later to write a book like this. But apart from that, it's in other respects it's like time, because a lot of the words and language associated with it, like the word prodigy, is something that we as humans foist upon an idea that is really inexplicable. That's what I was trying to get at, this idea that language was just constantly out of my grasp, which I feel probably most writers, and especially poets, and I conceived of this work poetically for sure, are constantly feeling all the time that at some level we have to settle for what language can do. And this is also tied in very much with borders and the impassability of borders as well.
I guess those ideas or expectations, those adult expectations on a child, writing is a way to break free, to break out of that border of this is the talent that you have. Creating in a completely different art form must be a way of claiming a different sort of independence or maturity when it comes to creativity. Is there something very liberating about being Simon Tedeschi, the author, rather than Simon Tedeschi, the classical pianist?
Oh, tremendously. A review that came of the book recently, which was thankfully a very positive one, but more importantly was itself incredibly well written, described me as the author as a kind of phoenix rising, and that's what it really does feel like in many respects. It's a creative upswell, and that word is used deliberately because the publisher is Upswell, but it is a creative upswelling of myself, and it's something that I knew was always there but had to wait. I think as somebody who's been a pianist for such a long time, the most common word in the bio is younger. He was the youngest to do this, the youngest to do that, the youngest to do that. But the greatest gift I could have given my writing is waiting.
Waiting so long, or letting that first book marinate in you till the time was right, is there an appetite for more writing after this?
Absolutely. I mean, I've just written that essay, absolutely. And still, for me, as somebody who is so impatient, possibly has undiagnosed ADD, and is so tied to accomplishment, with all of those associations that come from it, it's very frustrating. But as I've discovered, if you practice a piano passage for 6 months or a year, it will generally come. But writing is not like that. Writing will resist you until it is ready, and even then, half the time it won't come. So I've gone from one difficult profession to another, and one very unprofitable one to another.
Well, you haven't tried poetry yet, so there's always, the slope continues, as I'm sure Bryan could let you know. The essay that Simon just referred offhandedly to was the Calibre Prize-winning essay about his grandmother, which is published in the current Australian Book Review. It's a beautiful piece of writing if you haven't had a chance to look at that yet. Bryan, a final question to you, and I guess you can wear this, you can put on your creative writing professor hat as well as your writer and reader hat, is both your book and Simon's are difficult books. They ask things of the reader. They need attention. They require focus. What are the kind of benefits for a reader in giving our time to complex, demanding works like the two that we've heard from today?
I think the benefit is in the process. The benefit is the pleasure in any rich experience, any complex experience where you can engage with the same work multiple times and get different things out of it, and that it can change on your shelf. that it's not the same book when you come back to it a year or 5 years later. I think that kind of complexity is why I love poetry. It's the kind of complexity I seek in all kinds of work, and it's the kind of complexity that I hope to achieve. Those kinds of works are challenging, but they present a certain kind of nutritive value that you can't get in certain other works. It sort of depends what you're going for, and there is a question of reader tolerance. But I guess you write for the reader of that particular work. So I guess I'd respond to that.
I do feel that both of these works repay more revisiting than Hot Tub Time Machine. Of that, I feel quite confident. Please join me in thanking both Simon and Bryan. And both authors are signing books, so if you haven't got a copy of either of their books, hopefully this has just whetted your appetite for some nutritional reading, and you can go and grab a copy and ask Simon or Bryan to sign them for you.
Thank you.